My name is Nora Walsh, and I am 33 years old. The mediation agreement was finalized at 23 minutes past 10 on a Wednesday morning in March, and I know that detail precisely because I had been watching the wall clock in the lawyer's boardroom for the better part of an hour, while my ex-husband's solicitor went over the asset schedule. One more time, as though rereading it might somehow change the numbers. It didn't. When my own lawyer slid the final page across the table and I signed my name at the bottom, something I had been carrying for 7 years quietly put itself down. I didn't cry. I had done all of that months earlier, alone in the apartment I'd rented in Mississauga after I moved out. By the time we reached that boardroom, I wasn't grieving anymore. I was finishing something. The marriage had not been terrible in obvious ways. That's the part people don't always understand when I try to explain it. My ex-husband was not cruel. He was not absent. He was simply a man who had grown up understanding that certain people mattered and certain people were decorative. And over 7 years, I had slowly become, in his mind, one of the decorative ones. His mother had helped shape that belief. She had been working on it since the day she met me. I had one errand to run after I left the downtown office. Under the terms of the settlement, I was required to drop off the house keys in person by end of business that day. The matrimonial home in Oakville that my ex-husband and I had shared for 5 years. The house had been jointly listed on the market 6 weeks earlier, pending the divorce finalization. A buyer had submitted a firm offer 3 weeks ago, conditional on that finalization. As of 10:23 that morning, the condition was met. The sale was done. My ex-husband had known about the listing. He'd signed the listing agreement. What he hadn't done was mention any of it to his mother. Looking back, I understand that the timing of everything that day could look calculated. It wasn't about timing for the sake of impact. Every decision I had made over the previous 8 months had been about survival, about documentation, about protecting what was legally mine to protect. The timing was incidental to the facts, but I won't pretend it felt bad either. I pulled into the Oakville driveway just after noon. The elm tree in the front yard was still bare from winter. It would be weeks before it leafed out, and the lawn had that gray, half-finished look that southern Ontario gets in early March when the snow has melted but the color hasn't come back yet. I had always loved that house in spring. I was actively not thinking about the spring version of it as I walked up the front path, manila envelope in hand, keys inside, relevant settlement pages clipped to the front. My mother-in-law was already on the front step when I arrived. I don't know how she had known I was coming, but she had the look of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. Arms crossed at her chest, chin lifted, wearing the expression I had cataloged over 100 dinners and holidays, and long car rides home where I would replay it in my head trying to figure out what I'd done. It was the expression that said she had already decided how this conversation was going to go, and my only role was to accept the terms. She moved to the center of the step before I reached the porch. "You have no business being here," she said. Her voice was loud enough to carry clearly across the front yard. A man walking his dog on the sidewalk slowed slightly, then kept going. "This is family property. You are no longer part of this family, Nora. Whatever you think you're here for, turn around. Do you hear me? Get off this driveway." I stopped walking about 6 feet from the step. There was a moment, and I noticed it clearly, the way you notice things when your nervous system has finally stopped bracing, where I felt absolutely nothing I would have expected to feel. Not shame. Not the old compulsion to apologize, to soften my voice, to find a smaller version of myself that might fit through the space she was offering. What I felt instead was a very specific kind of quiet. The kind that only settles in when you already know something the other person in the room doesn't know yet. I looked at her for a moment without responding. She took my silence as weakness and pushed harder. "I don't know what you think you're owed from this family, but whatever it is, you've taken enough. This is done. Go home." "I'm here to return the keys," I said, keeping my voice even. "It's outlined in the settlement terms. I can leave them in the mailbox if you'd prefer." "I don't care what your settlement." "The house sold this morning," I said. She stopped. It was remarkable, honestly, the way the sentence landed in the middle of hers. She had been building toward something, her voice rising, and then she simply stopped. Her mouth stayed slightly open, the next word already halfway formed, and then nothing came out of it. "The offer went firm when the mediation agreement was signed at 10:23, I continued, in the same tone I used to walk a client through a tax schedule. "Possession closes in 60 days. The listing was signed by both parties 6 weeks ago. Your son was aware. I paused a half second. He just didn't tell you. She shook her head slowly. That's not. You couldn't have. The realtor's contact information is on page 3 of the documents clipped to this envelope. I held it up. They're expecting to hear from the new owner's lawyer this week about the walkthrough schedule. You may want to arrange your plans accordingly. I watched her hand reach out and grip the iron railing on the side of the step. She held it the way people hold something, when the ground suddenly stops feeling reliable beneath them. He would have told me, she said. The certainty in her voice had thinned down to almost nothing. He didn't, I said, because it was easier not to. That's been the pattern for a long time. With a lot of things. I wasn't trying to wound her with the observation. I was just done pretending it wasn't true. There's something else you should probably know before you call him. The board of directors at Ashford Wealth held a conference call at 9 this morning. Your son is no longer managing director of the firm. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. She let go of the railing. Her arms dropped to her sides and she stood there, and I watched the certainty she had walked onto that step with simply leave her face. That's not possible, she said finally. He runs that firm. His grandfather built it. His grandfather built it, I said. And the company has received formal regulatory correspondence from the OSC in each of the past 3 quarters, and 2 of its largest institutional clients have quietly moved their portfolios elsewhere in the last 18 months. Those are documented facts. I was the one who documented them. What my mother-in-law had never understood, what my ex-husband had found it convenient not to correct, was that I had not spent 7 years standing in the background of that marriage, arranging dinner party seating, and smiling at her comments about how I didn't really grasp the business side of things. 8 years before I married her son, when the firm was carrying a level of debt that genuinely threatened its operating license, I had approached the board as an investor. I put in $140,000 of my own money, an inheritance from my late father that I had held in a personal account, in exchange for shares registered in my name. My name, not a joint account, not a company account, mine. I joined the board as an observer, later formally. My ex-husband had been grateful for about 2 years, and then had gradually found it easier to describe me to people as a shareholder in a general sense, and not elaborate further. And I had let him, for longer than I should have, because I had been more invested in keeping the peace at those Sunday dinners than in correcting the record. Through the divorce settlement, I had been awarded an additional allocation from the equalization process. Shares drawn from my ex-husband's position. Combined with my original stake, the math had shifted. I had worked through the documentation carefully with my own solicitor. I had sent the board a formal written summary of my compliance concerns in September, and again in November and again in January. I had requested a meeting in December that was canceled twice. By March, the independent directors had seen enough. I had simply made sure the formal vote took place on a timeline that aligned with everything else being finalized. I prepared for this, I said, for a long time. She was gripping the railing again. You planned this to hurt him, she said. I made decisions that were within my legal rights, I said, to protect a company that more than 260 people depend on for their livelihoods. That's the whole story. Not everything that affects your son is about your son. I set the envelope on the porch step beside her, gently, because I didn't think she was in a state to take it from my hand. The blue fob is for the side entrance, I said. The alarm code is the same. Your son will receive documentation on the new code before possession. I'd suggest calling him soon. He's going to have a difficult afternoon. I turned and walked back to my car. She didn't say anything else. I heard the creak of the iron railing, and then nothing. I didn't look back. I drove as far as the Tim Hortons on Lakeshore before I pulled into the parking lot. Not because I was in any distress, but because my hands had developed a slight tremble that happens to me sometimes in the aftermath of things I've been building toward for a long time, and I thought it was better to sit for a few minutes than to merge onto the QEW. I ordered a medium dark roast. I sat in the parking lot and watched a woman in a yellow parka push a stroller along the path by the lake. My phone rang 20 minutes later. I looked at the screen, my ex-husband. I let it ring twice before I answered. What did you do? It was not a question. His voice was flat in a way that meant he was working hard to keep it that way. My mother just called me. She's barely coherent, Nora. She's saying the house is sold and that the board. Both things are accurate, I said. You could have warned me. His voice shifted, quieter, and there it was. The sentence I had known was coming before he even dialed. I sent you a written compliance summary in September, I said. I flagged the OSC correspondence in November and again in January. I requested a formal meeting with you and the compliance officer in December, and you canceled it twice. I told you in October in our kitchen that the direction the firm was heading was going to catch up with it. You told me I was being catastrophic and to let you manage your own company. I paused. So I did. And then I exercised my rights as a shareholder that I've held for 8 years. And the board made the decision they had been building toward for 2 quarters. I didn't write the performance record. You did. He was quiet for a moment. I could hear road noise. He was driving somewhere the way he always dealt with things, in motion. This is about us, he said finally. You're doing this because of the divorce. There are 268 people employed by that firm, I said. Some of them have worked there since before you were managing director. This was never about you and me. If it had been about you and me, I would have liquidated my position 18 months ago and walked. I stayed and I documented and I flagged and I tried to give you every opportunity to fix it. When the board decided the answer was to remove you and bring in someone who could, I voted with them because I agreed with them. That's the whole story. He started to say something else. I let him get 3 words into it, and then I gently ended the call. Not as a gesture of cruelty. I was simply done. The conversation had gone where it needed to go. I didn't have the appetite for another circuit of the same argument. I sat there for a few more minutes with the coffee getting cooler in my hand, looking out at the lake. Early March in Ontario, the water that flat, pewter color it gets before the season turns. A cyclist went past on the path below. A transit bus idled at the stop across the road. Life simply continuing on. That evening, I met Vivienne Ashabi for dinner at a small Italian place on King Street West. Vivienne had been the board's newest independent director, brought in 14 months earlier from an institutional governance background. And she had been the one, 8 months ago, who had sent me a quiet 3-line email after reading my September compliance summary, saying only that she thought I was correct, and that she was not alone in thinking so. She had been careful and methodical about the process after that. So had I. She was already at the table when I arrived, a glass of sparkling water in front of her, a file folder on the seat beside her. She asked how I was before she said anything else. I told her I thought I was okay, and that I'd probably know better in a week. She nodded. She slid the folder across the table. The board wants to discuss an interim arrangement, she said. The firm needs a managing director while the formal search runs. Someone who understands the compliance landscape, knows the client relationships, and isn't going to be a flight risk when the OSC situation requires sustained attention over the next 6 to 8 months. She paused. Your name came up without objection. I looked at the folder. My own name on the header of a formal letter from a company that had spent 7 years treating me as peripheral felt genuinely strange. Not wrong. Just strange in the specific way that long-delayed things feel when they finally arrive. I want one condition before I open this, I said. Go ahead. We bring in an external compliance monitor for the first quarter, not as a statement about anyone currently at the firm, as a clean start. If we're repairing the regulatory relationship, we do it in a way that no one can question later. Vivienne looked at me for a moment, then she smiled, just slightly. That clause is already on page 4, she said. We wanted to see if you'd name it. I opened the folder. The terms were straightforward. Interim managing director role, renewable at 6 months, full operational authority, independent oversight structure, and a compensation arrangement that bore no resemblance to the work I had done for years without a title anywhere near matching it. I read every clause. I did not rush. I asked 2 clarifying questions about the scope of my authority over the compliance function, got answers I was satisfied with, and signed before dessert arrived. Driving home that night, I took the longer way along the lakeshore. It was properly dark by then, the city lights doing what they always do to the water, breaking into scattered pieces below the surface, moving but not going anywhere. I passed the exit that would have taken me toward Oakville, toward the elm tree and the iron railing and the step where my mother-in-law had stood this morning, absolutely certain she was sending me away from something that was hers to guard. I passed it and kept driving north toward the city. I had spent years at that family's table absorbing the version of myself they had decided I was, useful in unmeasurable ways, Easy to overlook, not quite sophisticated enough, not quite serious enough, someone who would eventually learn to be grateful for the seat she'd been given. I had smiled through it because I had believed for a time that being needed invisibly was the same thing as being valued. It is not the same thing. I understand that now the way I understand it in my bones. I was not the woman who had been told to get off a driveway anymore. I was the woman who had quietly known, standing on that front path with the keys in a manila envelope, that the driveway itself had already been sold out from under the person doing the screaming, and who had said so without raising her voice once, and then walked back to her car and driven away. If you're watching this and something in it landed somewhere familiar, subscribe. There are more stories coming. Every one of them is about a woman who stopped apologizing for knowing her own worth, and what happened when she finally stopped.